Dr. Sarah Chen had seen enough death in her 32 years to recognize its approach from a mile away. The way breath became shallow and labored, how the eyes lost their focus, the subtle shift in skin tone that spoke of failing circulation. She had witnessed it in countless human patients across 3 different star systems, but never had she expected to see those same telltale signs in a creature that belonged in ancient Earth mythology. The dragon lay before her in the medical bay of the research station Harmony's Edge, its massive form barely fitting within the reinforced walls designed for much smaller patients. Scales that should have shimmered like polished obsidian now appeared dull and lifeless, their edges curling slightly as dehydration set in. Each breath sent visible ripples across its serpentine neck, and the great golden eyes that had once struck terror into the hearts of seasoned Marines now gazed at her with an intelligence that was both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. Sarah had been stationed on Kepler 442b for 18 months, treating everything from mining accidents to rare atmospheric poisoning cases. The planet's harsh environment and toxic storms made medical emergencies a regular occurrence, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. 3 days ago, a joint human-alien patrol had found the dragon collapsed near the sulfur geysers in the eastern quadrant, its body riddled with what appeared to be projectile wounds and severe burns. The creature belonged to a species the Galactic Council had designated as Draconis stellaris, though the locals simply called them star dragons. They were among the most feared predators in known space, capable of surviving in the vacuum between worlds and possessing breath weapons that could melt through starship hulls. Yet this one had not attacked when the patrol approached. Instead, it had simply watched them with those ancient eyes, too weak to flee or fight. Getting the dragon to the medical station had required 3 heavy-lift shuttles and a miracle of engineering. The creature's mass exceeded 12 tons, and every movement threatened to collapse the improvised transport system. But something in those golden eyes had convinced Commander Morrison to authorize the rescue mission. Perhaps it was the same quality that now kept Sarah working around the clock, refusing to give up despite the overwhelming evidence that her patient was beyond saving. The dragon's physiology was unlike anything in her medical training. Its body temperature ran nearly 40 degrees hotter than baseline human normal, requiring specialized cooling systems to prevent the medical equipment from overheating. Its circulatory system operated on principles that seemed to defy conventional biology, with what appeared to be multiple heart chambers distributed throughout its torso. Most challenging of all was the creature's unique neurological structure, which included not just a brain but a complex network of neural clusters that extended throughout its spine and into the base of its wings. Sarah had spent the last 72 hours working with xenobiologist Dr. Marcus Webb, trying to understand enough of the dragon's anatomy to provide meaningful treatment. They had managed to stop the most severe bleeding and stabilize its core temperature, but the internal damage was extensive. Burns covered nearly 30% of its body, and several projectiles remained lodged deep within its chest cavity, too close to vital organs to safely remove with their current equipment. The worst part was the creature's eyes. Despite its obvious pain, despite wounds that would have killed most known species hours ago, the dragon remained alert and aware. It watched Sarah's every movement with an intelligence that made her increasingly uncomfortable. There was recognition there, a comprehension that suggested the creature understood exactly what was happening to it. The neural activity is still off the charts, Dr. Webb announced from his position at the monitoring station. The xenobiologist had barely left the medical bay since their patient had arrived, driven by the same inexplicable compulsion that kept Sarah working despite her exhaustion. Whatever these things use for consciousness, it's operating at levels that shouldn't be possible given the trauma it's sustained. Sarah nodded absently as she adjusted the 4-drip that delivered nutrients directly into the dragon's bloodstream. They had been forced to improvise the entire treatment protocol, synthesizing medications based on tissue samples and hoping that their educated guesses wouldn't cause more harm than good. The fact that the creature had survived this long suggested they were doing something right, but Sarah knew they were fighting a losing battle. The medical bay's atmospheric controls hummed constantly, working to maintain the delicate balance required to keep both human staff and their alien patient alive. The dragon's natural environment included atmospheric pressures that would crush unprotected humans, while the oxygen-rich environment humans required was mildly toxic to the creature's respiratory system. Every breath was a compromise that brought them closer to mutual understanding and mutual destruction. As Sarah checked the dragon's vitals for the 100th time that day, she noticed something that made her pause. The creature's massive head had turned slightly, following her movements with a precision that suggested far more than mere animal awareness. When she moved to the left side of its body, those golden eyes tracked her perfectly. When she returned to check the monitoring equipment, its gaze followed her there as well. "Marcus, are you seeing this?" she called softly, not wanting to startle their patient. The ocular tracking is too precise for unconscious response. "I think it's trying to communicate." Dr. Webb looked up from his data tablets, following Sarah's gaze to the dragon's face. The creature was indeed watching them, but, more than that, its eyes seemed to be moving in deliberate patterns. Short movements to the left, followed by longer sweeps to the right, then, brief periods of direct eye contact that felt almost like punctuation marks in an unknown language. "My God," Webb whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "It's trying to talk to us. Look at the pattern repetition. That's not random movement. That's deliberate communication attempt." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the implications hit her. First contact protocols existed for a reason, but those protocols assumed healthy participants on both sides, translation matrices, and proper diplomatic frameworks. This was an injured, dying creature trying to communicate something important enough to use its remaining strength for the attempt. The dragon's breathing became more labored, and Sarah noticed the skin around its wounds taking on a grayish tint that she had learned to associate with systemic failure. Whatever it was trying to say, they were running out of time to understand it. She made a decision that would have horrified the medical ethics board back on Earth but felt absolutely right in the moment. Moving closer to the dragon's head, Sarah positioned herself within what she estimated was its natural focal range. The creature's eyes immediately locked onto hers with an intensity that made her catch her breath. Up close, she could see flecks of silver and amber within the gold, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. "I'm here," she said softly, feeling somewhat foolish but compelled to respond to the obvious intelligence behind those eyes. "I'm trying to help you." "What are you trying to tell me?" The dragon's response was immediate and startling. Its eyes closed for a long moment, then opened again and focused on a point beyond Sarah's shoulder. Following its gaze, she saw it was looking at the medical supply cabinet where they kept the emergency stims and pain medication. Then, the eyes returned to her face, blinked once deliberately, and looked back at the cabinet. "It wants something from medical supplies," Webb said, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "But what? Pain relief? Some kind of stimulant? Or?" The terrible possibility hung in the air between them. The dragon might be asking for something to end its suffering, a final mercy that would spare it from the slow, agonizing death that seemed inevitable. Sarah had faced similar requests from human patients in hopeless situations, but this felt different. The intelligence behind those eyes was vast and ancient, carrying the weight of experiences she couldn't begin to imagine. Before Sarah could respond, the dragon made a sound that was unlike anything she had heard before. It wasn't quite a roar, not exactly a growl, but something that seemed to contain elements of both along with harmonics that resonated in her bones. The sound was brief but incredibly complex, carrying emotions and meanings that her human ears couldn't fully process but somehow understood on a deeper level. It was a sound of loss, of desperate need, and of something that might have been hope. The dragon's eyes never left Sarah's face as the sound faded, and she realized with crystalline clarity that this was no simple request for medication. The creature was trying to communicate something far more important, something that had driven it to cling to life despite injuries that should have been fatal hours ago. "Run a full-spectrum analysis on that vocalization," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Every harmonic, every frequency variation. If it's trying to tell us something, we need to understand what." As Dr. Webb began working with the audio equipment, Sarah found herself lost in the dragon's gaze. There was something almost hypnotic about those eyes, and she began to notice details she had missed before. The pupils weren't round like human eyes, but formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. Within the iris itself, she could see structures that resembled circuitry, as if biological evolution and technological advancement had somehow merged. The dragon made the sound again, shorter this time but with subtle variations that suggested it was trying to simplify its communication for her benefit. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the pattern. The creature was learning, adapting its attempts at communication based on her responses. This wasn't just intelligence. This was genius-level problem-solving happening in real time despite massive physical trauma. "Sarah, you need to see this," Webb called urgently from his station. "The acoustic analysis is showing patterns I've never seen before. It's not just sound. It's layered, almost like multiple conversations happening simultaneously on different frequencies." Sarah reluctantly broke eye contact with the dragon to examine Webb's findings. The display showed a three-dimensional representation of the creature's vocalization that looked more like a complex mathematical equation than a simple sound wave. Multiple frequency layers interacted in ways that created interference patterns and harmonic resonances of stunning complexity. "It's beautiful," she whispered, staring at the data. "Like music and mathematics had a baby with pure emotion." "More than that," Webb replied, his excitement barely contained. "Look at these subsonic components. They're identical to gravitational wave patterns we've detected from certain deep space phenomena. I think this creature's species might communicate using gravitational fields as well as sound." The implications were staggering. If the dragons could manipulate gravitational fields for communication, it would explain their legendary ability to travel between worlds without spacecraft. It might also mean that their dying patient was trying to send a message across interstellar distances, calling for help from its own kind. Sarah returned to the dragon's side, noting that its breathing had become even more labored in the few minutes she had been away. The gray discoloration was spreading, and she could see that several of the smaller wounds had begun bleeding again. Whatever the creature was trying to communicate, they had very little time left to understand it. "Your people," she said, looking directly into those ancient eyes. "You're calling to your people, aren't you?" The dragon's response was immediate and unmistakable. Its eyes widened slightly, then it made a much softer version of the complex sound, followed by what could only be described as a sigh. The relief in its expression was so human that Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "They can't hear you from here," she continued, though she wasn't sure if the creature could understand her words or was simply responding to her tone. "The station's shielding blocks most exotic radiation. But maybe we can help." Dr. Webb had been listening to their exchange with growing amazement. "Sarah, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, it's incredibly dangerous. We don't understand their technology, and attempting to amplify gravitational wave communication could destroy the station." Sarah looked back at the dragon, whose eyes now held an expression she could only interpret as pleading. The creature was dying, probably had been since before they found it, but it was using its last strength to call for help. Not for itself, she realized, but for something else. Someone else. "It's not calling for rescue," she said quietly, the understanding hitting her like a physical blow. "It's warning them about something." The dragon's eyes closed briefly in what looked like confirmation, then opened again with renewed intensity. It turned its head slightly, looking toward the medical bay's main viewport that showed the alien landscape beyond. In the distance, Sarah could see the sulfur geysers where the patrol had found their patient, now glowing more brightly than she remembered from earlier observations. "Marcus, when was the last time you checked the geological surveys from the eastern quadrant?" Sarah asked, a cold certainty growing in her stomach. Webb's fingers flew over his control panel, calling up the most recent data from the automated monitoring stations scattered across the planet's surface. What he found made him go pale. "Seismic activity has increased by 400% over the last week," he reported, his voice tight with worry. "Sulfur emissions are up, core temperature readings are climbing, and there are some kind of energy signatures I've never seen before coming from deep underground." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The dragon hadn't been hunting in the eastern quadrant when it was injured. It had been investigating something, perhaps trying to warn someone about a threat that the humans hadn't yet recognized. The wounds covering its body weren't from weapons designed to kill a single creature. They were from area denial systems, automated defenses designed to keep everyone away from something important. "Show me the energy signatures," she demanded, moving to look over Webb's shoulder at his displays. The readings were unlike anything in the standard xenological database. The energy patterns seemed to pulse in complex rhythms that reminded Sarah of heartbeats or breathing, as if something vast and alive was stirring beneath the planet's surface. The geysers weren't just geological phenomena. They were exhaust ports for something much larger and more dangerous. How long do you estimate before whatever that is becomes a problem for us? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Webb ran several calculations, his face growing more worried with each result. Based on the escalation pattern, I'd say we have maybe 18 hours before the situation becomes critical. Less if the underground activity triggers major seismic events. Sarah looked back at the dragon, whose eyes had never left her face during the exchange. The creature somehow understood that she was beginning to grasp the situation, and she could see approval mixed with desperate urgency in its expression. "You tried to warn them, didn't you?" she said softly. "Your people, the mining colonies, maybe even us. But the automated defenses wouldn't let you get close enough." The dragon made a soft, low sound that seemed to convey agreement and regret in equal measure. Its breathing was becoming increasingly difficult, and Sarah could see that it was fighting to stay conscious despite the pain and systemic failure ravaging its body. "What is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure the creature could provide an answer she would understand. "What's down there that has you so frightened?" The dragon's response was to close its eyes and make a sound unlike any it had produced before. This vocalization was deeper, more primal, carrying harmonics that made the medical equipment vibrate and caused every human in the bay to feel a chill of ancestral fear. It was the sound of something immensely old and powerful, something that had been sleeping and was now beginning to wake. When the sound faded, the dragon opened its eyes one final time and looked directly at Sarah with an expression of profound gratitude and terrible sadness. Its breathing slowed, the golden eyes began to lose their focus, and Sarah realized that their patient was finally succumbing to its injuries. But, as consciousness faded from those ancient eyes, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. From deep underground, carried through the station's structural supports and amplified by the planet's unique geological formations, came an answering call. Something had heard the dragon's warning, something vast and patient and utterly alien. And it was beginning to respond. Dr. Webb's monitoring equipment went haywire as exotic radiation surged through the planet's crust, and emergency alarms began blaring throughout the station. In the distance, the sulfur geysers erupted in columns of superheated gas that reached into the upper atmosphere, and the ground beneath Harmony's edge began to tremble with the movement of something enormous stirring to life after eons of slumber. Sarah stood beside the dying dragon, her hand resting gently on its massive head, as she realized that their patient's desperate warning had come too late. Whatever the creature had been trying to prevent was already beginning, and the small research station with its crew of 47 souls was about to face something that had driven one of the galaxy's most feared predators to sacrifice its life in a futile attempt to sound the alarm. The dragon's eyes closed for the final time as the first massive tremor shook the station, and Sarah Chen, combat medic turned xenobiologist, found herself at the center of a crisis that would either destroy everything she had ever known or reveal truths about the universe that would change humanity's place in the cosmos forever. Outside the medical bay's viewport, something immense and ancient was rising from the depths of Kepler 442b, and the real story was only beginning. The first thing Sarah noticed when she regained consciousness was the silence. After hours of blaring alarms and the constant hum of life support systems, the absolute quiet felt wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of her body and trying to remember what had happened after the massive tremor had knocked her unconscious. Her head throbbed where she had struck the medical bay's wall, and her left shoulder ached with the deep, persistent pain of strained ligaments. But she was alive, which was more than she had expected when the station began coming apart around them. Slowly, carefully, she opened her eyes and immediately wished she hadn't. The medical bay was a disaster zone. Equipment that had once been precisely arranged for maximum efficiency now lay scattered across the floor in twisted wreckage. The main power coupling had been severed, leaving emergency lighting to cast eerie shadows throughout the space. Most shocking of all was the condition of their patient. The dragon was gone. Not dead, as Sarah had expected when consciousness finally left those golden eyes. Gone. The reinforced medical platform that had barely contained the creature's 12-ton mass was empty except for a few scattered scales and what looked like scorch marks burned deep into the metal. The restraining systems designed to keep violent patients secure had been cut through with surgical precision, their molecular bonds severed so cleanly that the edges still glowed with residual heat. Sarah struggled to her feet, fighting off waves of dizziness as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The dragon had been dying when the tremors started, its vital systems failing despite everything she and Dr. Webb had done to save it. There was no way the creature could have simply walked away from injuries that severe. Yet the evidence was undeniable. "Marcus," she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the damaged bay. "Marcus, are you here?" A groan from behind the overturned medical cart answered her question, followed by the sound of someone pushing wreckage aside. Dr. Webb emerged from the debris looking considerably worse for wear, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by torn clothing and a spectacular bruise across the left side of his face. "Thank God you're alive," he said, wincing as he straightened up. "I thought that last tremor might have brought down the whole section." "How long were we unconscious?" Sarah checked the chronometer on her wrist, noting that the display flickered intermittently with power fluctuations. "About 4 hours, based on these readings." "Marcus, where's the dragon?" Webb followed her gaze to the empty medical platform, and his expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching awe. "That's impossible," he whispered, moving closer to examine the cut restraints. These bonds were designed to hold a rampaging Corvan battle beast. Nothing could have cut through them without industrial-grade equipment. "Well, something did," Sarah replied grimly, kneeling to examine one of the severed restraints more closely. The cut was perfectly smooth, showing none of the rough edges or heat distortion she would have expected from conventional cutting tools. More disturbing were the biological samples scattered around the platform. Shed scales, yes, but also what appeared to be tissue samples that glowed with an internal light. "Sarah, look at this," Webb called from across the bay, where he was examining one of the monitoring stations that had somehow survived the destruction. "The readings from just before we lost consciousness. The dragon's vital signs didn't just improve. They went completely off our measurement scales." Sarah joined him at the functional terminal, studying the bio readings that Dr. Webb had managed to recover from the station's backup memory cores. What she saw there challenged everything she thought she knew about biology, physics, and the nature of life itself. The data showed the dragon's vital signs climbing steadily in the hours before the major tremor, but not in any pattern that made medical sense. Its core temperature had risen to levels that should have been immediately fatal, while its neural activity spiked to readings that exceeded the monitoring equipment's capacity to measure. Most impossible of all was the apparent regeneration of damaged tissue happening at a rate that defied known biological processes. "This is reading like the creature underwent some kind of metamorphosis," Webb said, his voice filled with scientific excitement and professional skepticism in equal measure. "But that's impossible. Dragon physiology doesn't include any known transformation phases." Before Sarah could respond, the medical bay's emergency communication system crackled to life with a burst of static that resolved into the strained voice of Commander Morrison. "All personnel, this is command. Report to the main assembly hall immediately. We have a situation that requires all hands." Sarah and Webb exchanged glances, both aware that Morrison's definition of situation usually involved imminent threats to life and limb. They gathered what medical supplies they could carry from the wreckage and made their way through corridors that showed clear signs of structural damage from the seismic activity. Harmony's Edge had been built to withstand the harsh conditions of Kepler 442b, but the recent geological upheaval had tested those specifications beyond their limits. Hairline fractures ran through walls that should have been impervious to anything short of direct weapons fire, and several sections were sealed off entirely due to atmospheric breaches. The main assembly hall was packed with the station's 47 personnel, their faces showing the strain of the last few hours. Commander Morrison stood at the front of the room, her usually perfect uniform disheveled and her expression grim in a way that Sarah had never seen before. "People, I'm going to be direct because we don't have time for diplomatic language," Morrison began without preamble. "The seismic activity we've experienced is not natural geological phenomena. Our deep scans have detected artificial structures beneath the planet's surface, structures that are actively responding to some kind of external signal. A murmur of concerned voices rippled through the assembled personnel, but Morrison continued before anyone could ask questions. Furthermore, our long-range sensors have detected multiple contacts approaching our position. Large contacts, moving at speeds that suggest advanced propulsion technology. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. The dragon's warning hadn't been about geological disasters. It had been trying to alert them to the presence of something else, something that had been sleeping beneath the planet's surface and was now awakening. "Commander," Dr. Webb spoke up from beside Sarah, "we need to inform you that our patient is missing. The dragon we've been treating disappeared sometime during the seismic event, under circumstances that suggest it may have been more capable than we initially realized." Morrison's expression darkened further. "Doctor, I'm afraid your patient is no longer missing. It's currently positioned approximately 2 kilometers from the main entrance, and it appears to be waiting for something." The implications of those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The dragon hadn't escaped. It had been healed somehow, transformed by whatever was awakening beneath the planet, and now it was outside their defenses. Whether it was there as a threat or something else entirely remained to be seen. "Is it hostile?" asked Security Chief Ramirez, her hand instinctively moving to the weapon at her hip. "Unknown," Morrison replied. "It hasn't made any aggressive moves, but it's positioned itself directly between us and the most likely escape routes. More concerning is what our sensors are detecting from its location. Energy readings that match some of the signatures we're getting from the underground structures." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the dragon's desperate attempts at communication, the complex vocalizations that had contained gravitational wave patterns. The creature hadn't been calling for rescue. It had been participating in some kind of awakening protocol, using its remaining strength to help activate whatever lay dormant beneath the planet's surface. "Commander, I need to go out there," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've been working with the dragon for the last 3 days. If it's still capable of communication, I might be able to establish contact." "Absolutely not," Ramirez interjected before Morrison could respond. "That thing is an apex predator that could vaporize you from 100 meters away. We need to focus on fortifying our position and calling for evacuation support." "Evacuation support that will take weeks to arrive," Morrison pointed out grimly. "Our scheduled supply run isn't due for another month, and emergency response from the nearest naval station would require at least 3 weeks transit time." Sarah felt the weight of their situation settling over the assembled personnel like a suffocating blanket. They were trapped on an alien world with something vast and unknown stirring beneath their feet, while a creature of legendary destructive capability waited outside their doors. Making matters worse was the growing certainty that this situation was no accident. "Commander, there's something else we need to consider," Webb said quietly. "Based on our analysis of the dragon's communication attempts, we believe it was trying to warn us about this situation before it became critical. The creature may have been injured while attempting to prevent whatever's happening now." Morrison studied the xenobiologist carefully, weighing his words against the tactical realities they faced. "Are you suggesting that our patient might be an ally rather than a threat?" "I'm suggesting that the situation is more complex than a simple first contact scenario," Webb replied. "The dragon's behavior patterns, its communication attempts, and the circumstances under which we found it all suggest that it was operating with knowledge we don't possess." Before anyone could respond, the station's external sensors began registering new contacts. Multiple signatures were approaching from the underground structures, moving through the planet's crust as if the solid rock offered no resistance whatsoever. Whatever had been sleeping beneath Kepler 442b was sending representatives to the surface. "All personnel to emergency stations," Morrison ordered, her command voice cutting through the rising panic in the assembly hall. "Medical and science staff to the main laboratory, security teams to defensive positions, engineering crews to maintain critical systems." As the personnel began moving to their assigned positions, Sarah found herself caught between conflicting impulses. Her medical training demanded that she focus on preparing for casualties and maintaining the health of the station's crew. But something deeper, some instinct that had been awakened during her hours caring for the dying dragon, insisted that the real solution lay outside the station's protective walls. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me," she said, grabbing Dr. Webb's arm as they moved toward the laboratory. Run a complete analysis of the dragon's tissue samples we collected. Focus on any unusual cellular structures or energy signatures. I have a feeling we're missing something important about what that creature really was. Webb nodded, understanding the urgency behind her request even if he didn't fully grasp her reasoning. As they reached the laboratory, Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her commanding officers but felt absolutely necessary in the face of their impossible situation. She was going to find a way to communicate with the dragon, even if it meant leaving the relative safety of the station to do so. The laboratory's analysis equipment was still functional despite the structural damage, and Webb immediately began processing the biological samples they had collected. Sarah used the time to study the external sensor readings, trying to build a mental picture of what was happening beyond the station's walls. The dragon was indeed positioned roughly 2 kilometers from the main entrance, its massive form clearly visible on thermal imaging despite the planet's natural heat sources. More intriguingly, it appeared to be moving in slow, deliberate patterns that resembled the communication attempts it had made while dying in their medical bay. The underground contacts were more difficult to interpret, but the energy signatures suggested massive artificial structures that extended for kilometers beneath the planet's surface. Whatever civilization had built them operated on a scale that dwarfed human engineering capabilities, and the fact that they had remained hidden until now suggested technology far beyond anything in the known galaxy. "Sarah, you need to see this," Webb called urgently from his analysis station. "The tissue samples we collected from the dragon aren't entirely biological. There are structures here that look more like integrated technology than natural cellular components." Sarah joined him at the microscopic imaging display, where highly magnified images of the dragon's shed tissue revealed structures that challenged every assumption she had made about alien biology. Interwoven with obviously organic cells were complex geometric patterns that pulsed with energy and seemed to respond to external stimuli. "It's a hybrid," she breathed, understanding flooding through her as the pieces fell into place. "The dragon isn't just a natural creature. It's been modified, enhanced with technology that integrates with its biological systems." "More than that," Webb replied, adjusting the imaging parameters to reveal even more detail. "Look at these quantum resonance patterns. The technological components are actively communicating with something external. The dragon isn't just enhanced. It's part of a larger network." The implications were staggering. If the dragon was connected to the underground structures, then its presence outside the station might not be a threat but rather an attempt to facilitate communication between the awakening civilization and the humans who had stumbled into their territory. Sarah made her decision with the clarity that comes from absolute certainty. "Marcus, I'm going out there. The dragon trusted me enough to let me treat its injuries, and I think it's trying to bridge the gap between us and whatever's down there." "Sarah, that's insane," Webb protested. "We don't know what the technological integration has done to its behavior patterns. It might not even remember you." "There's only one way to find out," Sarah replied, gathering medical supplies and emergency communication equipment. "If I'm wrong, then we're probably all dead anyway once those underground contacts reach the surface. If I'm right, then maybe we can find a peaceful solution to this situation." As alarms continued to blare throughout the station and seismic activity intensified beneath their feet, Dr. Sarah Chen prepared to leave the safety of human technology behind and trust her life to the wisdom of an alien intelligence that had already sacrificed everything to warn them of approaching danger. Outside the station, the dragon waited with the patience of something that had lived for centuries and the urgency of something that knew time was running out for all of them. The truth about Kepler 442b and the ancient civilization sleeping beneath its surface was about to be revealed, and Sarah Chen would be the first human to learn that some alliances transcend the boundaries of species, technology, and even life itself. The airlock sealed behind Sarah with a finality that made her question every decision that had led to this moment. She stood in the station's outer vestibule, wearing a modified environmental suit and carrying medical supplies that probably wouldn't matter if her theory about the dragon proved wrong. Through the reinforced porthole, she could see the creature waiting in the distance, its massive form motionless against the alien landscape. The dragon looked different than she remembered. Where once its scales had been dull with injury and approaching death,
they now gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the planet's seismic activity.
Its size appeared to have increased as well, though that might have been a trick of perspective.
Most striking were its eyes, which glowed with an intensity that was visible even from 2 kilometers away.
Sarah activated her suit's communication system, establishing contact with the station's command center.
"This is Dr. Chen. I'm proceeding with the contact attempt. If this goes badly, tell my family I was doing what I thought was right."
Commander Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers, tight with worry and barely controlled anger.
"Sarah, return to the station immediately. That's a direct order. We've detected massive movement in the underground structures, and whatever's down there is heading for the surface."
"All the more reason to attempt communication now," Sarah replied, beginning the walk toward the dragon's position.
"If they're hostile, we're dead anyway.
If they're not, then someone needs to establish dialogue before fear makes the situation worse."
The walk across Kepler 442b's harsh surface gave Sarah time to think, though she wasn't sure that was entirely beneficial.
The planet's atmosphere was technically breathable for humans, but the high sulfur content and atmospheric pressure required protective equipment for extended exposure. More concerning were the energy readings that her suit's sensors were detecting, exotic radiation signatures that suggested the very fabric of spacetime was being manipulated by whatever lay beneath the planet's crust.
As she approached the dragon's position, Sarah began to notice details that the station's sensors had missed. The creature wasn't simply waiting.
It was actively doing something, its massive head moving in precise patterns while low-frequency vocalizations resonated through the ground beneath her feet. The sounds were similar to the communication attempts it had made while dying in her medical bay, but infinitely more complex and powerful. The dragon noticed her approach when she was still several hundred meters away. Its great head turned toward her with fluid grace, and those luminous eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed despite the protection of her environmental suit.
For a moment that stretched into eternity, woman and dragon regarded each other across the alien landscape.
Then, the creature did something that stopped Sarah's heart with surprise and wonder. It lowered its massive head in what could only be described as a respectful bow, the same gesture that intelligent species throughout the galaxy used to acknowledge peaceful intentions. "Hello again," Sarah said softly, activating her suit's external speakers. "You're looking much better than when I last saw you." The dragon's response was immediate and overwhelming. It vocalized in a complex harmonic pattern that Sarah's enhanced hearing protection couldn't entirely filter, while simultaneously projecting something that bypassed her physical senses entirely. Images flashed through her mind with startling clarity: vast cities beneath the planet's surface, populated by beings of impossible beauty and technological sophistication, fleets of star-spanning vessels that moved through space without conventional propulsion, and, underlying it all, a sense of profound age and wisdom that made human civilization seem like a brief flicker of light in cosmic darkness. When the mental contact ended, Sarah found herself on her knees in the sulfur-tinged soil, her suit's systems struggling to compensate for the physiological shock of direct neural interface with an alien intelligence. The dragon watched her with obvious concern, its massive form shifting closer while being careful not to overwhelm her with its presence. "My God," Sarah whispered, struggling back to her feet. "You're not just enhanced with their technology. You're one of them." The dragon's confirmation came as another, gentler wave of mental contact. Sarah saw the truth of her statement in images that transcended language. The dragon species had been the first to achieve true integration of biological and technological evolution, becoming partners with an ancient civilization that spanned multiple star systems. They served as explorers, guardians, and intermediaries, their enhanced forms capable of surviving in environments that would destroy more fragile beings. But something had gone wrong on Kepler 442b. The images showed the dragon arriving to investigate unusual energy signatures from the planet's surface, only to discover that automated defense systems had activated around structures that were supposed to remain dormant for centuries more. The creature had been injured while attempting to shut down the defenses, its enhanced physiology keeping it alive long enough to reach the planet's surface and attempt to warn the human colonists. "The mining operations," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "We've been accidentally triggering their security systems." "That's why you were so badly hurt." The dragon's mental response carried emotions that were unmistakably affirmative, along with a sense of urgency that made Sarah's pulse quicken.
The automated defenses weren't just protecting dormant structures.
They were protecting something that was actively dangerous to carbon-based life, something that the ancient civilization had deliberately isolated and contained.
Through the mental link, Sarah saw images of the mining equipment that had been operating in the eastern quadrant for the past 6 months.
The humans had unknowingly drilled into containment systems that had been sealed for millennia, releasing energies that could destabilize the entire planetary system if not quickly contained.
"How long do we have?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
The dragon's response came as a countdown that appeared directly in her consciousness, less than 12 hours before the breached containment led to a cascading failure that would render Kepler 442 be uninhabitable for the next 1,000 years.
The only solution was to activate the planet's ancient repair protocols, a process that required cooperation between the dormant artificial intelligences below ground and surface dwellers who could provide the necessary authorization codes. Authorization codes that humans obviously don't possess, Sarah said grimly.
But the dragon's mental touch carried something unexpected: hope. The ancient civilization had built their systems with the assumption that intelligence could take many forms, and their authorization protocols were designed to recognize problem-solving capability rather than specific biological signatures. With the dragon serving as an intermediary, it might be possible for human and artificial intelligences to work together long enough to prevent the catastrophe. The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to vibrate with increasing intensity, and she realized that their conversation had attracted the attention of whatever was rising from the underground structures. The dragon's eyes shifted towards several points on the horizon where the planet's surface was beginning to crack and buckle, revealing glimpses of architecture that defied human understanding. "They're coming to the surface," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled fear.
The dragon's mental touch carried reassurance along with detailed information about what was approaching.
The beings rising from below weren't conquerors or threats, but ancient artificial intelligences that had been awakened by the containment breach. They were desperate to prevent the catastrophic failure that would destroy not only the planet but also the vast repositories of knowledge and technology they had been created to protect.
Sarah activated her suit's communication system, establishing contact with Harmony's Edge. "Commander Morrison, this is Dr. Chen.
I'm in communication with our former patient, and the situation is more complex than we realized.
We're not facing an invasion.
We're looking at a mutual crisis that requires cooperation to resolve."
Morrison's response was immediate and skeptical.
"Sarah, your position is being monitored by massive artificial constructs that are emerging from underground structures."
"How is that not an invasion?"
"Because they're not here for conquest," Sarah replied, her confidence growing as the dragon's mental contact provided her with additional information. "They're emergency response systems trying to prevent a planetary disaster that our mining operations accidentally triggered.
And they need our help to fix it."
The implications of Sarah's words hit the command staff like a cold shock.
Harmony's Edge wasn't under attack.
They were inadvertent vandals who had damaged systems they didn't understand, and now they needed to help repair the damage before it killed everyone on the planet. As if summoned by their conversation, the first of the underground intelligences reached the surface. Sarah watched in awe as a structure that resembled a living building emerged from the cracked ground roughly a kilometer to her east. Its surface was covered in patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid metal, while energy conduits visible through translucent walls pulsed with power that made her suit's radiation detectors ping frantically. The dragon moved closer to Sarah, its massive form providing both physical protection and mental reassurance as more structures breached the planet's surface. Through their continued mental connection, Sarah could sense the artificial intelligences beginning to establish communication protocols with each other after centuries of dormancy.
"What do they need from us?"
Sarah asked, watching as a second structure emerged to her north, this one resembling a crystalline tower that hummed with harmonics she could feel in her bones.
The dragon's response came as a flood of technical information that her human mind could barely process.
The ancient repair systems required constant monitoring and adjustment during the restoration process, but the artificial intelligences had been designed to operate in partnership with biological overseers who could provide intuitive problem-solving and creative adaptation to unexpected circumstances. Humans might not possess the specific authorization codes, but their demonstrated problem-solving abilities and willingness to risk their lives to prevent catastrophic failure qualified them as potential partners in the restoration effort.
How many people would they need?
Sarah asked, beginning to understand the scope of what was being proposed. The answer that flowed through the mental link made her catch her breath: all of them.
The restoration process would require every human on Harmony's edge to serve as biological interfaces for different aspects of the repair protocols.
It would be dangerous, potentially fatal if something went wrong, but it was the only way to prevent the complete sterilization of the planet. Sarah looked back toward the research station, visible as a small collection of structures in the distance, and thought about the 47 souls who had no idea that their survival depended on trusting their lives to alien technology they couldn't possibly understand.
Commander Morrison, she said into her communication system, I need you to assemble all personnel in the main assembly hall. We have a proposal to consider, and it's going to require a unanimous decision.
What kind of proposal? Morrison's voice carried the wariness of someone who suspected they weren't going to like the answer. The kind that gives us a chance to save not just ourselves, but also preserve something incredible that's been hidden beneath this planet for thousands of years, Sarah replied. But it's going to require trust in capabilities we've never imagined and partnership with intelligences we're only beginning to understand. As more structures emerged from the planet's depths and the dragon's mental contact provided her with increasingly detailed information about the restoration process, Sarah began to realize that this crisis represented something far greater than a simple survival scenario. It was first contact with a civilization that operated on principles of cooperation rather than conquest, beings who valued knowledge and life over territory and resources. The choice facing the humans of Harmony's Edge wasn't just about preventing a planetary disaster. It was about proving that humanity was ready to join a broader community of intelligent species, to serve as partners in maintaining the delicate balance that allowed life and consciousness to flourish throughout the galaxy. Sarah looked into the dragon's luminous eyes and saw reflected there the wisdom of ages, the patience of immortal beings, and the hope that different forms of intelligence could work together toward common goals. The creature had sacrificed its life to warn them of approaching danger, then been restored by ancient technology to serve as a bridge between species separated by millions of years of evolution. Now it was time for humanity to prove worthy of that sacrifice, to demonstrate that they could be trusted with knowledge and responsibilities that spanned the cosmos. The dragon's last cry hadn't been one of despair, but the first note in a song of cooperation that would echo through the stars for generations to come. As the artificial intelligences completed their emergence and began establishing the technological frameworks necessary for the restoration process, Sarah Chen stood at the center of a moment that would define humanity's future among the stars. The choice was no longer about survival, but about transformation, about becoming something greater than they had ever imagined possible. And it all began with a dying dragon's desperate attempt to save everyone, human and alien alike, from a catastrophe that would have consumed them all.